The transport truck rattled to a stop just inside the gate, kicking up a cloud of dust that hung in the air longer than it should have. Staff Sergeant Dana Voss stepped down without waiting for anyone to offer a hand, slung her duffel over one shoulder, and looked around the forward operating base like she was checking it off a list rather than seeing it for the first time. Nobody came to greet her. That wasn't unusual on a base like this. Transfers happened all the time. Soldiers shuffled from one outpost to another depending on where the paperwork said they were needed. But something about the way she stood there, patient and unbothered, made the few soldiers nearby pause just long enough to notice her. She wasn't young. Not old either. Maybe late 30s, early 40s, with the kind of weathered calm that made it hard to guess. Her uniform was clean but unremarkable. No patches or unit tabs that meant anything to the soldiers watching. Just a name tape that read Voss and a quiet, unreadable expression. "That her?" one soldier muttered to another, nodding toward the new arrival. "Thought they were sending us another shooter." "Guess not," the other replied. "Looks like a paperwork transfer to me." Word had already gotten around before she arrived. A reassignment nobody had requested, dropped into their unit with no real explanation. The kind of transfer that usually meant someone's career had stalled out, shuffled sideways into a role nobody else wanted. Logistics, supply, the unglamorous end of the war. Dana didn't correct anyone. She checked in with the duty officer, accepted her assignment without comment, and asked exactly one question before heading to find her quarters. "Do you have a current terrain map of the valley to the north? Updated within the last month, if possible." The duty officer blinked at her. "We're not running anything north of here right now, Sergeant. Nothing's scheduled." "I understand," she said. "I'd still like the map if one exists." He found her one anyway, mostly because it was easier than arguing and didn't think much of it. Soldiers asked for all kinds of things when they were bored or anxious about a new posting. He filed it away as nothing. By the time she reached the barracks, the whispers had already taken shape. Fast, the way they always did on a base where there wasn't much else to talk about. She was the leftover, the one nobody else wanted. Some said she'd washed out of a combat role years ago and had been riding a desk ever since. Others said she'd requested a quiet posting herself, tired of the field, content to coast out the rest of her contract somewhere safe. Corporal Marcus Reyes heard both versions before he'd even seen her face. Reyes ran point for the unit's reconnaissance element, young, sharp, confident in the particular way that came from never having been seriously tested. He found her sitting alone at the mess tent that evening, eating without urgency, the terrain map folded neatly beside her tray. "You're the new logistics transfer," he said, more statement than question, dropping into the seat across from her without asking. "Something like that," Dana said. "They sent you up here because nobody else had room for you?" She looked at him for a moment, not offended, not amused, just taking him in the way she seemed to take in everything. "Something like that," she repeated. Reyes smirked, glanced at the map. "What's that for? You planning a vacation?" "Just like to know the ground I'm standing near. We're not running missions north. Nothing's out there but goat trails and bad cell signal." "Good to know," she said, and went back to her food. It wasn't much of an exchange, but it was enough. Reyes walked away from that table already certain of who she was. Somebody coasting, somebody who talked in riddles because she didn't have anything real to say. He repeated the conversation to a few of the others that night, embellishing just enough to get a laugh. "She's got a map of nowhere and nothing to say about anything." The nickname started before lights out. Map Lady. Harmless, on the surface. The kind of joke units passed around about anyone new, anyone different, anyone who didn't immediately prove themselves. What nobody mentioned, because nobody noticed, was the detail buried in the supply manifest that came through with her transfer paperwork. A single line, easy to miss, listing her gear requisition from her previous posting. Most of it was unremarkable, standard issue. But one item stood out to absolutely no one, because no one bothered to read that far down the list. A long-range optic, The kind issued almost exclusively to designated marksmen and reconnaissance specialists, not to anyone working logistics. The page got filed away with the rest of the intake paperwork, unread past the first few lines, the same way most of the unit had already decided they understood exactly who Dana Voss was, and exactly how little she mattered. Dana finished her meal, folded her map back into her jacket, and went to find her bunk, saying nothing more to anyone for the rest of the night. The bunk they gave her was the worst one in the row, closest to the generator, where the noise never fully stopped, and the canvas above her cot had a tear that let in a thin trickle of dust every time the wind picked up. Nobody apologized for it. Someone had decided the new transfer could take whatever was left over, and Dana hadn't said a word in protest. She just dropped her duffel at the foot of the cot and started unpacking like the noise and the dust were things she'd dealt with 100 times before. The morning briefing was where Reyes decided to make his point in front of everyone. The unit gathered in the operations tent, maps pinned to the board, coffee going cold in too many hands. Dana stood near the back, arms crossed, listening without comment as the platoon sergeant ran through the day's patrol rotation. When he finished, Reyes raised a hand, not because he had a real question, but because he wanted an audience. "Sergeant Voss," he said, loud enough to carry, "since you're new, you gonna be handling supply requisitions for the patrol, or you want in on something more exciting? I know logistics can get a little slow." A few soldiers laughed. Not cruel, exactly. The kind of laugh that came easy when someone gave you permission to laugh at the new person. "I'll do whatever I'm assigned," Dana said evenly. "Right, 'cause I heard you used to be out in the field, way back, before they figured out a better fit for you." Reyes let the words sit there, watching for a reaction that didn't come. "No offense. Things change. People get old, get tired. Nothing wrong with finding your lane." "None taken," Dana said. The platoon sergeant moved on, mostly because there wasn't anything else to say, and the briefing wrapped without further incident. But the exchange had done what Reyes wanted. It drew a line in the room, and everyone understood which side of it Dana belonged on. By midday, the jokes had multiplied past anything Reyes had started. Someone left a box of expired ration packs outside her tent with a note that read, "For the quartermaster," misspelling her rank on purpose. Someone else asked her, in front of half the unit, if she needed help reading the terrain map, since maybe her eyes weren't what they used to be. Dana didn't rise to any of it. She picked up the ration boxes without comment, corrected nothing, asked for nothing. It was Specialist Tully who first noticed something didn't add up, though he didn't think much of it at the time. He was a quiet kid, barely 20, assigned to compile the patrol logs and cross-check coordinates before they went up the chain. He'd made an error in his grid reference, a transposed digit that put their planned route half a kilometer off from where it should have been, and was hunched over the table trying to figure out where he'd gone wrong when Dana walked past, glanced at the paper for maybe 2 seconds, and kept walking. "Your third waypoint's off," she said, not stopping. "You flipped the last 2 digits on the northing." Tully stared at the page, checked it against the master coordinates. She was right, exactly right. And she hadn't even slowed down to look twice. "How'd you—" he started. But she was already gone, back toward the supply tent like the moment hadn't happened. He didn't say anything to the others, not because he was protecting her, but because he wasn't sure what he'd even say. The logistics lady fixed my grid reference without looking it up. It sounded like nothing, but it sat with him anyway. A small itch he couldn't quite scratch. The kind of detail that didn't fit the story everyone else had already agreed on. That evening, Reyes found a reason to walk past Dana's tent again, this time with 2 other soldiers trailing behind him, half looking for entertainment. He found her field stripping a rifle on a tarp outside her tent, methodical, unhurried, every motion clean. "Didn't know logistics still qualified on weapons," he said. "Everyone quals," Dana said, not looking up. "Sure, just figured you'd be rustier." She set the bolt carrier down, met his eyes for the first time since the briefing. "I'm not rusty, Corporal." Something in the way she said it, flat, certain, without a trace of defensiveness, made one of the soldiers behind Reyes shift his weight, the laugh dying in his throat before it fully formed. Reyes held her gaze a beat longer than he meant to, then forced a grin and turned it into a joke for the other's benefit. "We'll see," he said, and walked off before the silence could stretch any further. Dana watched him go, then finished reassembling the rifle in the fading light, her hands never once slowing down, never once needing to think about what they already knew how to do. The patrol was supposed to be routine, a sweep through the foothills east of the base, checking on a cluster of villages that had reported unusual movement the week before. Reyes led the element, 6 soldiers plus Dana, who'd been assigned almost as an afterthought, tacked onto the roster because the platoon sergeant figured she could handle radio traffic if nothing else. Nobody expected trouble. That was the first mistake. They were 2 hours out, moving along a dry riverbed that cut between 2 ridge lines, when the first shots came from above. Not a full ambush at first, just probing fire, testing their reaction. Reyes called the halt, got everyone into cover behind a low stone wall, and tried to raise base on the radio. Nothing came back but static. "Comms are down," Tully said, voice tight, working the dial like it might fix itself if he turned it enough times. "Keep trying," Reyes snapped, scanning the ridge above them through his scope. The fire had stopped as suddenly as it started, which was worse, somehow, than if it had kept coming. Silence meant they were repositioning. Silence meant they hadn't given up. Specialist Okafor, the unit's lead navigator, took a round through the shoulder trying to get eyes on the enemy position. Not fatal, but enough to drop him hard against the wall, blood already soaking through his sleeve. Dana moved to him fast, pressure on the wound before anyone else had finished registering what happened, her hands steady in a way that should have struck someone as strange, and didn't, not yet, because there wasn't time to notice anything except the immediate problem in front of them. "He needs more than a field dressing," she said, working quickly, "but it'll hold for now." With Okafor down, the unit had no one left who could read the terrain with any confidence. Reyes pulled out his own map, the standard issue version that hadn't been updated in months, and tried to plot a route back toward the base, the only route he knew, the one they'd walked in on. "We backtracked the way we came," he said. "Stay low, move fast." "That's the route they'll expect," Dana said. Reyes didn't look up from the map. "It's the route I know. It's also the route that puts us back through that draw," she said, pointing without needing to check the map herself. "Open ground, no cover for at least 400 meters. If they've got anyone positioned to cut us off, that's where they'll do it." "You got a better idea, map lady." The nickname came out sharper than he meant it, frustration bleeding into something closer to contempt. "Because last I checked, you don't know this ground any better than I do." Dana didn't answer right away. She finished tying off Okafor's dressing, checked his pulse, then looked up at Reyes with an expression that had finally lost its patience, though her voice stayed level. "I asked for a map of this valley 4 days ago," she said, "before anyone told me we'd be operating here. You can backtrack through the draw if you want. I'd suggest you don't." Reyes hesitated, not because he believed her, not yet, but because something about the certainty in her voice didn't match anything he'd decided about her over the past few days. It didn't fit the joke. It didn't fit Map Lady, the logistics transfer, the woman everyone had already filed away as harmless and irrelevant. He made his decision anyway, because admitting otherwise meant admitting he didn't know what to do, and that wasn't something he was ready to say out loud in front of his own squad. "We move on my call," he said, and gave the order to head back the way they came. It went wrong within the first 100 meters of the draw. Gunfire opened up from the high ground on both sides, not probing this time, but coordinated, the kind of fire that meant they'd been watched the entire way and allowed to walk into exactly the position someone wanted them in. One soldier went down clutching his leg. The rest scattered for what cover the open ground offered, which wasn't much, pinned low behind rocks too small to fully protect them. "We're cut off!" Tully shouted, the radio in his hand still useless. There's no way back through, and I don't know another route. Reyes tried to think. Tried to find an answer in a map that had stopped being useful the moment they entered the kill zone, and found nothing. The fire kept coming, methodical, patient, the kind that wasn't trying to finish them quickly because it didn't need to. It was Dana's voice that cut through the noise, calm in a way that didn't belong to the moment and somehow steadied it anyway. "There's a wash 40 meters to our left," she said. "Runs below the ridgeline, out of their sight lines. It'll get us around behind them instead of away from them." "That's not on any map I've got," Reyes said, his voice cracking under the gunfire. "It's not on any map you've got," Dana said. "Corporal, I need you to trust me right now, or none of us are walking out of this draw." He looked at her, really looked, for the first time since she'd arrived, and understood, somewhere underneath the noise and the fear, that the woman in front of him was not who he decided she was 3 days ago. But there wasn't time to reckon with that yet. There was only the choice in front of him, and the seconds running out to make it. Reyes had maybe 3 seconds to decide, and every instinct trained into him over 4 years of service was screaming that trusting an unknown route from someone he'd spent days mocking was the kind of decision that got people killed. But the alternative, staying pinned in open ground while the fire kept finding new angles, wasn't a decision at all. It was just waiting to die slower. "Move!" he shouted. "Left now! Follow Voss!" They went low and fast, Dana leading without hesitation, cutting toward a fold in the terrain that hadn't been visible from where they'd taken cover. The wash dropped away beneath the ridgeline exactly where she said it would, shallow enough to move through at a crouch, deep enough to break their silhouette from the gunmen above. The fire that had been finding them moments before suddenly had nothing to track. "How did you know this was here?" Tully gasped, half carrying Okafor, who was pale now and fading in and out of focus. "I read the contour lines," Dana said, not slowing down. Same way anyone would, if they bothered to. It wasn't the full answer, and somewhere in the chaos, Tully understood that. Nobody read contour lines well enough to find an invisible wash under fire. Not without having walked ground like this before, not without having done it more than once. They moved through the wash for almost 10 minutes, Dana setting the pace, calling turns before they came into view, anticipating dead ends before the team reached them. Twice she signaled a stop seconds before a 2-man patrol crossed the ridge above. Not because she heard them, the soldiers realized later, but because she'd already worked out where a patrol covering that ground would need to walk, and positioned the team accordingly. "She's not reading a map," one of the soldiers muttered to Reyes, breathless, watching her move. "She's reading them." Reyes didn't answer. He was watching the same thing, and the pieces were starting to assemble into a shape he didn't want to look at directly yet. It was Okafor, drifting in and out of shock, blood loss pulling his thoughts loose from whatever filter normally held them, who said the thing that broke it open. "You're her," he mumbled, staring up at Dana as she adjusted his dressing during a brief halt. "Voss, I read about you. Training cycle 2 years back. They used your op as a case study, the one in—" He stopped, breath catching. They blacked out the location. "Said you walked a 4-man element out of a collapsed perimeter, no comms, no extract, for 6 days. Dana's hands didn't stop working on the dressing, but something in her face went still. "That's classified material, specialist," she said quietly. "You shouldn't have had eyes on it." "It wasn't supposed to have a name attached," Okafor said. "Just initials. DV." Reyes felt the floor of everything he'd assumed give way at once. He remembered the briefing now. Not clearly, not in detail, but enough. An after-action case study from a training cycle, taught by an instructor who'd refused to give specifics, who'd said only that the operator in question had been part of a unit that didn't officially exist on the rosters most soldiers ever saw. He'd thought it was ancient history, a story from another decade. "You ran point on classified ops," he said slowly. "That's why you knew the terrain. That's why you asked for the map before anyone told you we'd be out here. You already knew." "I had a working theory," Dana said. "Recon patterns in this region don't change as much as people think they do. I wanted to confirm it before I needed it. You let us call you Map Lady, Reyes said, and it came out sounding like an accusation, though it was really something closer to disbelief. You decided who I was before I said a word, Dana said, finishing the dressing and rising back into a crouch. I didn't see much use arguing with it. We can talk about that later if we live long enough to have the conversation. Right now, we still have 400 meters to the extraction ridge, and they're going to figure out where we went eventually. She was already moving again before anyone could answer, scanning ahead, calculating the next stretch of ground like she'd never stopped being the person Okafor had just described. Like the version of her that filed supply manifests and said nothing. In briefings had only ever been the surface, and underneath it the whole time had been someone who'd done this, exactly this, more times than any of them could guess. Reyes followed her without another word of protest, and for the first time since she'd arrived, he wasn't thinking about what to call her. The last 400 meters were the hardest, not because the ground was worse, but because the enemy had finally realized their element had slipped the kill zone and started working to close the gap. Dana kept the team moving in short bursts, reading the terrain for cover before she'd call them forward, never letting them bunch up in the open for more than a few seconds at a time. 2 o'clock, low ridge, she said at one point, dropping the team flat before anyone else had seen anything. A patrol passed 80 meters out, never turning their direction, never knowing how close they'd come. Reyes realized, watching her, that she wasn't guessing. She was running calculations the rest of them didn't have the experience to even know existed. Angles, sight lines, the rhythm of how a search pattern unfolds when the searchers think they still have the advantage. Near the top of the ridge, with the extraction point finally in sight, the enemy got eyes on them again. Fire opened up from below, closer than before, and Reyes felt something graze his arm hot enough to make him stumble before he understood he'd been hit. Dana didn't hesitate. She got a hand under his good arm, hauled him toward the last stretch of cover, and laid down 2 precise shots toward the muzzle flashes below that bought them the 4 seconds they needed to clear the ridgeline. It wasn't wildfire. It wasn't panic. It was the kind of shooting that came from a body that had done exactly this before, more times than anyone watching could count. The extraction helicopter found them 11 minutes later, comms finally cutting through the static long enough to call it in. They loaded Okafor first, then the wounded soldier from the draw, then Reyes, who tried to wave off the help and didn't get far before his legs reminded him otherwise. Dana climbed in last, scanning the ridge behind them until the doors closed. Nobody on that flight said a single word about logistics. Back at the base, the story moved faster than any official report could. By the time the wounded had been handed off to medics, half the unit already knew some version of what happened in the draw. Map Lady, the woman they'd mocked for 4 days straight, had read terrain like she'd written the map herself, called a route that didn't officially exist, and put 2 rounds exactly where they needed to go under fire that would have rattled soldiers twice her supposed experience. Reyes found her outside the medical tent that evening, his arm bandaged, sitting alone the same way she always seemed to sit. Like company was optional, and her own thoughts were enough. "I owe you something better than what I gave you," he said. And it cost him something to say it plainly, without deflecting into a joke the way he usually would have. "You don't owe me an apology, Corporal," Dana said. "You owe the unit a better habit of finding out who someone is before deciding you already know." He sat down across from her, the same way she'd let him do that first night in the mess tent, except this time, the air between them held none of the old contempt. "Why didn't you just tell us? At the start. Would have saved everyone a lot of trouble." Dana considered the question for a moment. "Telling people doesn't usually change how they treat you," she said. "It just changes how fast they pretend to respect you. I've seen both. I'd rather earn it the slow way, if it comes to that." Word eventually came down through channels that confirmed what Okafor had said in the field. A sealed personnel file, references to operations that wouldn't be declassified for years, an instructor's training case study that had never been meant to circulate as far as it had. Command didn't make a show of it. They didn't need to. The soldiers who'd called her Map Lady didn't say it again, Not as a joke, not as anything. Tully found her a few days later, the corrected grid reference still folded in his jacket pocket, and asked, a little sheepishly, if she'd be willing to look over his navigation work going forward. "I'd be glad to," Dana said. That was the whole of it. No parade, no speech, no demand for the apology she probably deserved 100 times over. Just a unit that had learned, the hard way, what it cost to decide who someone was before they'd shown you, and a woman who'd never needed their approval to know exactly who she'd always been.